You know, whenever we tune into a modern football match today, we're basically watching a high-speed game of chess. But it absolutely wasn't always this way. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to explore how the beautiful game underwent a massive paradigm shift. We'll look at how it evolved from a game driven by pure physical instinct and really rigid formations into this highly intellectual, fluid system of space management that we see today. So, it begs the question, right? How exactly did football transform from a rigid defensive struggle into a fluid, attacking art form? It's a fascinating journey that takes us all the way from a legendary sun-drenched clash in Lisbon back in 1967 straight into the heated ideological, tactical culture wars of the 1990s.
We're going to trace this evolution through 5 key chapters. We'll start with a clash of football ideologies, look at the triumph of the Lisbon Lions, dive into the total football rebellion, break down the zonal marking revolution, and finally, unpack Spain's football culture war.
All right, Chapter 1, Clash of Football Ideologies. We're looking at the 1967 European Cup final matchup.
Think of this final as the ultimate inciting incident. It was a complete stylistic showdown. On one side, you had Helenio Herrera's Inter Milan, the two-time defending champions. They were absolute masters of Catenaccio, which was this deeply cynical but highly successful defense-first system that relied heavily on a sweeper and strict man-to-man marking. Now against them was Jock Stein's Celtic, playing this incredibly fluid attacking 4-2-4 system with overlapping fullbacks. And get this, every single player on that Celtic squad was homegrown, literally born within a 30-mile radius of Glasgow. It was the ultimate test of defensive orthodoxy up against pure attacking flair.
Moving right along to Chapter 2, Triumph of the Lisbon Lions. May 25, 1967, at the Estadio Nacional in Lisbon.
What's so amazing about this specific match is how it proved that an attacking system could actually dismantle Europe's most feared defense. Things actually started out perfectly for the Italians. Inter's Sandro Mazzola scored a penalty right away in the 7th minute. And, true to their philosophy, Inter instantly retreated into their shell, putting 9 men behind the ball. But Celtic, they didn't panic at all. They just held the ball, pressed relentlessly, and then finally, in the 63rd minute, Tommy Gemmell unleashed this absolute 25-yard rocket to equalize. Then, late in the game, that nonstop pressure paid off again, with Stevie Chalmers scoring the winner in the 84th minute. The famous Italian wall had officially been broken.
Now to really put that dominance into perspective, just think about this number, 45. That is the staggering number of shots Celtic took on goal during the match, compared to a mere 3 from Inter Milan. 3! They also won 10 corner kicks to Inter's 0. So this definitely wasn't some lucky win. It was total, undeniable tactical domination. It proved for sure that negative, marginal football could be completely overwhelmed by an organized, relentless attack.
Which brings us to Chapter 3, the Total Football Rebellion, redefining space and time.
Celtic's historic victory sparked a massive offensive resurgence across Europe. And this set the stage for a visionary named Rinus Michels to really institutionalize attacking fluidity in the 1970s. Michels essentially saw the game as a fierce, dynamic battleground. He famously said, "Football is something like war. Whoever behaves too properly is lost." Under his watch, the days of static positions were completely over. Fullbacks were overlapping, strikers were dropping deep, and players were interchaining on the fly. To pull this off, you had to be tough, but actually, scratch that, more than tough, you had to be highly intelligent.
To understand this, we have to look at this really fascinating Dutch cultural concept at the core of his strategy, called maakbaarheid. It's basically the belief that you can actively shape, mold, and control a physical environment. When applied to football, Michel's teams use this idea to make the pitch feel as incredibly large as possible when attacking, stretching out to use every inch of grass. But the split second they lost possession, they flipped it. They used that exact same thinking to completely suffocate the opponent's space through intensely coordinated pressure. It was like the actual dimensions of the pitch were totally flexible.
And that flows perfectly into Chapter 4, the Zonal Marking Revolution, abstract concepts on the pitch.
Building directly on those ideas of controlling space, the late 1980s saw Arrigo Sacchi's AC Milan introduce a systemic shift that changed defensive structures forever. We're talking about zonal marking. Instead of the traditional method of shadowing a specific opponent everywhere they went, Sacchi required his players to collectively defend abstract zones. They would literally abandon the space furthest from the ball just to completely collapse the space around the ball. They weren't reacting to a man anymore. They were reacting to the ball's position, shifting and moving as a single coordinated unit.
But as you can imagine, executing this kind of abstract coordination was incredibly difficult. Players literally had to be re-educated. Sacchi practiced relentlessly, sometimes without the ball at all, and without any opposition on the pitch. His players repeated these defensive routines day after day after day just to learn how to keep precise distances from one another. In fact, one manager even compared these repetitive silent drills to going to church. They were just automating collective movements until it became pure muscle memory.
Right around this same time, Johann Cruyff was revolutionizing how players actually built the intelligence needed for these complex systems. Cruyff firmly believed a player's most important asset wasn't their legs, it was their brain. So he introduced what we call integrated training. He shifted practice away from pure physical suffering, like running endless laps, and moved toward complex, ball-centered tactical exercises. Players got their physical conditioning by doing highly technical work with the ball at their feet. The mind and the body were being trained together.
Okay, last but not least, Chapter 5, Spain's Football Culture War, the Old Guard versus the New Philosophers.
When these highly intellectual, theory-driven concepts hit Spain in the 1990s, they sparked an absolute culture war. It genuinely threatened the traditional identity and job security of the established managers. It was an ideological battlefield, plain and simple. The old school firmly believed football knowledge was instinctive. Success came from sheer grit, man-to-man marking, and harsh physical running under an authoritarian boss. The new school, on the other hand, was bringing in these rationalized systems, zonal marking, and abstract analysis.
Naturally, the resistance from the old guard was incredibly fierce. They had this deep-rooted belief that success was all about natural, innate talent. For example, listen to Javier Clemente, who was a very prominent traditionalist manager. He stated, "I used to say it wasn't Sacchi's Milan, but Baresi's." People like him argued that these complex tactics were just academic nonsense. In their view, success on the pitch was 100% due to the brilliance of the players, not the whiteboard philosophies of managers, especially managers who hadn't even played the game professionally.
But ultimately, as these tactics took hold, a brand new managerial identity was forged. Because zonal marking and integrated systems were so incredibly complex, a manager couldn't just point at an opposing player anymore and say, "Hey, go mark him." They had to teach a holistic collective system. They had to explain the why and the how. So tactical complexity basically forced managers to become educators. They had to rely heavily on communication skills and player comprehension rather than just barking orders. It forever changed the professional culture of football coaching.
And that brings us to where we are today. We've gone from the rigid man-to-man battles of 1967 into an era where the pitch is treated like this giant, breathing chessboard of moving zones and interconnected systems. Which leaves us with a pretty wild final thought. If total football and zonal marking completely overwrote the rules back then, what revolutionary paradigm shift is waiting just around the corner for the beautiful game? Seriously, how will the tactics we think are so cutting-edge today be viewed 50 years from now? Just a little something to think about the next time you sit down to watch a match. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the game.